Okay, this is it, guys. Our time together is starting to wind down, sadly, and again, what a weird semester for us, not to be together, but to be separated as part of this pandemic. What do we need to do now? We need to start closing some loops in our process. What are we going to talk about here? It's assessment scoring and candidate selection. So how do we get from the scores to the selection of the candidates? And that's where we're at right now. So we need to have some system of combining assessment scores, and multiple assessments will typically yield better results in the candidate selection process. We've gone through job analysis to develop a list of person specifications. From that person specifications, we then try to translate those into measurable qualities. And you see, much of the course has been devoted to those measurable qualities, how to select the measures to assess those qualities, but now we're in a position where we have to kind of be able to combine those qualities. And as Fenorin said, as I quoted last time, we got to figure out how to measure, how to mix up, hot potatoes and cold bananas, if you will. So multiple assessments are usually the better way to go. Yeah, we don't necessarily need to abandon an interview. We need to make a standardized interview that is validly predicts on-the-job performance, and we need a reliable scoring rubric. Behavioral tests, performance tests are probably the most useful as you're kind of trying to conclude as we get towards the end of the course. We might want a trait type test if we believe it validly predicts on the job performance. These tests are going to come at us with different scores, different scoring systems, so we have to standardize those scores, and that was the process of generating z-scores, for example, so it will allow us to make combinations. Multiple assessments, right, converge on who is the best overall candidate, and this is how we get there. So these multiple KSAOs to create a broader picture of the candidate's potential fit rather than relying on a single measure. I mean, consider how many of you have been, hired on the basis of a resume, which may or may not be real, and people seldom verify the contents of a resume, right? How many of you have been hired on the basis of your resume, an application, and an interview, and that's it? Notice, none of the skills have been assessed. No traits have been assessed. Nothing really of any utility has been assessed. And often the interview is, boy, I just sure like the way that person came off, as opposed to, wow, there's something that isn't right there. And notice, it's not quantifiable, as it's not a reliable information. So assessments vary in how they're scored, and we need an effective, meaningful way to combine those scores that does so reliably, and it does so that ensures validity of the selection process. So there's two ways of combining assessment scores, basically, at least the way we're going to talk about, and we're going to look at multiple hurdles and or compensatory approaches. So multiple hurdles, candidates must receive a passing score on an assessment before being allowed to continue on to the next assessment. And this is if you have some what you consider deal killers, but aren't necessarily successful in differentiating candidates who can pass, right? For example, can you drive a forklift or not? And we can put everyone on a forklift, in a safe environment and see if they can effectively use. And if they pass, good, they pass. But if there's other person specifications that are necessary beyond that, right? Let's get everyone past that hurdle. I'm not going to hire someone, and this is kind of how the logic works, I'm not going to hire someone who can't already drive a forklift. And if I make a statement like that, it implies then they must, in fact, have the ability to drive a forklift, and I'm going to set that up as a hurdle, right? If I'm looking at research professors, someone I'm going to hire for research, do they have any publications? And we might make that a hurdle. If someone applies, but they do not yet have any publications, then we might say, well, I don't know. I'm looking for, a qualified research professor, someone who has that skill and can demonstrate that skill through being previously published. So I might get some applicants of some new people who have not yet published, and I might just simply reject them because I'm looking for someone who has published. So I set that up as a hurdle, and notice hurdles can be tremendous cost and time savers. That is, if you can't drive a forklift, let's not bother. If you can't produce a research article that you've created. Let's not bother, right? So hurdles can be part of the assessment process. We typically put them up front to weed people out who don't have the basic qualifications that we require. Right? So it can be more costly and take more time to the need for candidates to make repeated visits to the different assessments. But again, it might represent overall times or energy or labor savings. And notice that this is from a spillover effect point of view. If we want to be transparent, we say, hey, look, here are the multiple steps we'll go through, and this step represents a hurdle. So if you pass here, you'll be welcome to continue on the application process. But if you don't pass here, what we're going to do is say maybe next time, or maybe you want to get this training, or maybe you want to get this done before you come and revisit us. Again, we're attempting not to waste people's time, although we may be engaging in lengthening the time of the process to a certain extent. This is a system of trade-offs that you will have to consider and negotiate as a human resources professional, right? But it can save money when screening out candidate prior to taking more expensive and or time-consuming assessments later in the process. So we may in fact have a pretty strict interview process, right? And it's a standardized interview process. And it's conducted by people who are very high up in the company. Let's say maybe department managers or vice presidents, and their time we consider extremely valuable. So we may want to only present them with a certain level of pre-qualified candidate. Rather than them having go through, let's say, necessarily all 40 applicants, we may have had several cut points so that these vice presidents are ultimately going to interview only 4 applicants for a single position. Again, numbers matter in this context. Sometimes it's used when the cost of poor performance on that characteristic is high, when, for example, when safety is at risk, right? So if it's a safety issue, then we might want to put that test out first and then not bring people in later into the process. Now, compensatory approaches, on the other hand, allow for people maybe to score high on some assessments and have that compensate for a lower score on other assessments. So this is more strictly a single equation that combines all the assessments, and I might be weak in one area, right? I might not be the best database designer, but I do know my way around a database at least somewhat adequately, but I'm a very good graphic designer, and maybe both of those qualities are necessary, and this will represent trade-offs. We're looking at some candidates who are better at this, we're looking at some candidates who are better than this, but we want to look that they have some level of combined ability for both. Right? Now, this approach is less useful in jobs where specific talents must exist at a minimum level. Right? And when we're talking about, let's say, lecturers, you're talking about teachers, can I deliver a clear lecture? This might be one of the first things that I do. And like at Columbus State, before we get too deep into this, before we consider too many things, let's have the person come in and give a 10-minute lecturette, right, on the functions of a neuron. And if they can't do that, then we can't be interested at all, right? So we might put that up front, right? That would be a hurdle approach if they couldn't do it. Now, if it's a compensatory approach, that is, then we might be more flexible in the nature of those qualities. So that's why we use compensatory. It can also identify future training opportunities. So we take these records in, you're a human resources professional. Not only do you do the hiring, let's say, but you oversee training, and you bring this candidate in and you say, look, they scored really high on this measure, less high, so what we're going to do is their overall score puts them at the top of the pack, but we've recognized now there's an opportunity for improvement in certain areas, and you might recommend training or develop a training package as part of their onboarding, what have you. So we focus training efforts on lower scoring areas of performance, right? So executing the compensatory approach, unit weighting. Give multiple assessments equal weight in computing an overall score. So what we do is we calculate z-scores, let's say on 5 items, and we say, hey, they're all equal in our estimation of importance, and your subject matter experts might have told you that, your incumbents might have told you that, your managers might have told you that. notice that we've looked at some assignments where we've said we've kind of prioritized certain skill areas over others, and that's about this weighting, right? Now, rational weighting then is what I've just described, assigns different subjective weight to each assessment score. So, you know, your ability to drive a forklift might be super important, and we're going to give it a weight of 0.5. That is, half of your overall assessment score is tied to your ability to drive a forklift. But second in importance is your ability to keep paperwork, right, neatly and efficiently and accurately. So we're going to assign that a weight of 0.3, and then we have two other items that are less important, still important, but less than the other two, and we assign 0.1 and 0.1. Notice 0.5 plus 0.3 plus 0.1 and plus 0.1 then is an overall 1, and this is how we kind of weight equations. Now, statistical weighting, we use a statistical technique such as multiple regression to assign a different weight to each assessment score, and this helps us in our calculation of who should be selected or who shouldn't. And multiple regression is the most scientific approach, right, on how to weight each assessment in computing the candidate's overall score. So let's look at a unit weighting approach, and this is where we're going in your at-home activity number 12. Right? So let's take a look, right? And we have two candidates here. We have Dahlia and we have Christoph, and the candidate. Now the assessment, right? We have the raw score, and then we have the standardized score, the Z-score, if you will. All right? So what do? We look then the interview. Well, they scored. Dahlia scored 9.5. Christoph scored 8.2. Right? The dexterity test. So we actually had them perform a physical test of dexterity, and we might have picked that up from the PAQ as a scoring criteria. Right? So we see that Dahlia scored 78 and Christoph scored 85 in this case. The knowledge test, right? Well, and that could be knowledge of the business, it could be knowledge of how to do something, some score, and it appears that this is scored on maybe 0 to 100. You see knowledge 82 for Dahlia, 93 for Christoph. Now, the values. Let us not think that we're going to completely abandon the idea of trait measures or value measures. And this might be some measure that we've developed that assesses value alignment with the company's values. It might be a canned product that we've purchased that purports to look at things like perseverance and honesty and these types of values. Whatever it is, I'm going to say that this one was probably scored on a scale of 0 to 20. Dahlia scored an 18.5, right, and Christoph scored 14. And then finally the performance measure, and this one looks to be maybe been measured out of 50, and this is some performance that we've observed and scored, and we see 35 and we see 42, respectively. Well, notice these scores, if we try to add these raw scores, and this is all our whole purpose of standardizing, it's meaningless, right? Because this is 9.5 on a scale of 10, this is 82 on a scale of 100. You just add that shit up, you come up with gobbledygook, right? It's meaningless. But if you add the standard scores up, this is, and what this is saying is 1.8 standard deviations above the mean. Here I scored 1 standard deviation above the mean, 1.4 standard deviations above the mean. Notice, we're talking the same frickin' language on each of these variables, and this is the beauty of standardizing, creating those Z-scores. Now, we see 6.3 and 6.3. Unfortunately, in this example, Dahlia and Christoph have scored equally, all right? But notice that we've given equal weight to each of these. None of these Z-scores has been prioritized. Now, we might come back and say, look, actually, we think that some of these qualities are far more important than others, so we might engage then in a statistical weighting approach. And what we're going to do is develop what's known as essentially a regression component. So what is the overall score? Well, it's B1 times A1, B2 times A2, B3 times A3. That is the score and then the weight. The score and the weight. The score and the weight. C is a constant. We may or may not need a constant in this. The B's are the statistical weights, and then the A's are the candidate scores. Oops, I gave it to you backwards. So let's do it right this time, right? In this case, the statistical weight is how much importance we put on that, and this is the actual score. How much importance times the actual score, right? And on each of the assessment methods. Any number of assessment methods can be used, right? And this equation can be 10 items long, it can be 3 items long, doesn't matter. So let's translate it to what we had in our example. What is their overall score? Constant, right? Whatever. So 0.1. We say the interview, it's not all that important. We're only going to weight at 10%. We're going to give it a 0.1. The dexterity for this job, pretty darn important. We're going to weight at 0.3. That is, it's going to be 30% of their total score is dexterity, right? The knowledge, super important. We're going to call that 50%, 0.5 priority on the knowledge, right? 0.2 on the value and 0.8 on the performance. Notice the weights are whatever we want to make them. It doesn't have to add up to 1 necessarily. So the statistical weighting approach then, what do? Well, we're returning to the same table, and what we're going to do is just add in, right, 2 new columns. So here were the raw scores, as we know, and we know that totaling the raw scores is meaningless, right? Here are the standard scores, the standardized scores, right? Here are the weightings that we calculated on the basis of our perceived needs, the nature of the job, often derived from subject matter experts or incumbents sitting down and discussing, hey, how important is this relative to this? And then they develop this list of weights, and now what we can do is see the adjusted scores. So what we have is they scored 9.5. The z-score is 1.8. That is 1.8 standard deviations above the mean. But it's relatively unimportant. It's the least important of all that they've been given. And that would be maybe appropriate for an interview. The adjusted then is 0.18. Right? Now, we do the same thing here. The dexterity we saw was relatively important, 0.3 importance. Right? We do the math, they scored a 1, so that's going to be 0.3, and so on down the list. Now, what we see is on the basis of what we perceive to be important versus less important measures, but they're all important, or otherwise we shouldn't be using any of them, but the weighted importance now clearly differentiates the candidates, and in this example favors Christoph then at 2.75 adjusted over 2.11. Notice this is, the weighting is somewhat subjective, yeah. To the extent that we understand the job and we gather data on performance criteria in the job, then the weighting can become less and less subjective and more objective if we're collecting longitudinal data on job performance, which we should be, right? So the statistical weighting approach then, to be most accurate, it requires a sample of several hundred or more hires, low intercorrelation among assessment methods. That is, if one assessment method is basically the same as another assessment method, then it starts to create problems for this. But if one assessment method is telling us essentially the same thing as another assessment method, why are we using both? We should probably only use one of the two, right? Save ourselves time and money. And remember, that goes back to understanding correlations and correlating each assessment method with each other. So several hundred hires. Because the weights can differ when derived from different groups of people, it's best to check the stability of the multiple regression equation in different groups to actually assess its effectiveness. That is, one group might suggest one set of weighting numbers, another group might suggest a different set of weighting numbers. That there's some subjectivity there. Again, the predictive importance can also be done longitudinally. If estimating the regression equation on a large sample is not possible, unit weighting or even rational weighting might be the better choice, as we described before. Validity can sometimes be enhanced by combining the multiple regression approach with global expert judgment. And then again, we're looking at literature to do that. Okay? So, combining multiple hurdles and compensatory approaches, we can do both, right? So often some job requirements are essential, but others can compensate for each other. So determine which are deal killers, make them hurdles, and then what can compensate or what's amenable to training maybe become part of the other, the compensatory approach. A data entry hire may need to type a certain number of words a minute with a minimum number of errors, which would be a minimum hurdle. So we bring that person in, give them a typing test. But then the cognitive ability and personality might be compensatory factors that we add in after the fact. Right? Typing tests can be used at the beginning, and then we can use the other measures. So the final choice, the cut score, maybe we employ a minimum. So let's say in that example, Dahlia, I think, scored, what, 2.11, Christoph 2.75. We may at some point in the future say, hey, anyone below 2.5, regardless, is not a hire, that we can create a cut point like that, right? And then we just need to do more people. Now, we may then but use rank ordering. That is, we need 5 people, and we're going to select the 5 highest no matter where they fall. So there's different styles of understanding that. Banding. Everyone who scores within a certain range of scores is considered to have performance equivalent to each other. And hiring with the band then can be done randomly or based on other factors like EO or affirmative action goals. And that's allowable. So this, one of the advantages of the banding is it might be a way to increase an organization's diversity by saying, hey, these 20 people fall in this band, the top band, we only need 5, so we'll find some method of selecting the 5 out of that 20 that might then look to other organizational goals. So other factors might be considered in a banding system. Bandwidths are usually calculated on the basis of standard error measures we described. So when using cut scores and rank ordering, additional decision needs to be made whether to hire from the top of the list down or to create a pool of finalists from which make a final choice on yet another criteria. The pool of finalists can be rank ordered based on global, specific assignments, selected randomly, banded. There's no one best method. You have to determine what the pros and cons of each method are. Whenever possible, the ability of the assessment scores to predict job success should be carefully evaluated. And this is that longitudinal analysis that we've been describing throughout the course. So guys, I hope this prepares you to take on at-home activity number 12. And this is it. This is the last hurrah. So I hope you've enjoyed the